get started. Welcome to the first colloquium this year. Happy New Year. And today our speaker is Dr. Kelvin Dalmasse. And Kelvin is new to NCAR and HAO. He just came recently from Paris Observatory, where he got his PhD in solar physics. And here his actually his research is on theoretical and observational solar physics, especially in the structure of solar magnetic field and its role in solar activities. Use both MHD simulations and also observations. Currently here, he's working with Sarah Gibson and Doug Nishka from CISL. I thought Doug was here. And on the data-constrained reconstruction of solar corona magnetic field. And his talk today actually will be on his PhD thesis research on magnetic helicity, electric currents, and free magnetic energy. Kevin?
All right, so thank you, Anli, and thank you everyone for coming to this colloquium, which will actually be a slightly updated version of my PhD defense. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I will give you an overview of what I've been working on during the last 3 years when I was a PhD student at Paris Observatory. And this work is about better understanding and constraining the conditions which are required for solar activity. And for that purpose, I will focus on 3 important quantities for the solar activity, and which are free energy, magnetic helicity, and electric currents. So before going any further, I'd like to mention that in this talk, everything that I will discuss will be discussed in the MHD framework. So that means that the solar plasma is treated as a single monofluid plasma, and I will focus on large scales, large spatial scales, and slow processes. By large scales, I mean larger than 100 kilometers, and by slow processes, I mean non-relativistic processes. So as you know, solar activity is a magnetic activity, and this magnetic activity is related to a transport of magnetic field from the deep convection zone into the solar atmosphere. And in the classical thin flux-tube approximation, the magnetic field is transported by coherent twisted flux tubes, such as this one. And the emergence of these flux tubes into the solar atmosphere leads to the formation of active regions. So that is to say, the formation of dark sunspots as seen in white light at the photosphere, as you can see here. The formation of opposite magnetic polarities, as can be seen in maps of magnetic flux at the photosphere, and an enhanced UV emission in the coronal magnetic field of the formed active region. The emergence of this magnetic field is accompanied with the transfer and accumulation of magnetic energy and electric current into the solar atmosphere. This is illustrated in this plot, where at the top you can see the unsigned magnetic flux and below the unsigned electric current during the lifetime of this active region. And as you can see here, the increase in electric currents is correlated with the increase of magnetic flux. This accumulation process is a slow process. It takes typically a few days for an active region to accumulate about 10 to the 25 to 10 to the 26 joules of energy. And this process occurs through the transfer of shear magnetic field. And this means that the electric currents here can take 2 forms: twisted magnetic field lines on one hand, and shear magnetic field lines on the other hand. Magnetic energy and magnetic shear do not accumulate indefinitely in active regions. They are regularly released, and this energy release leads to a formation of solar flares and coronal mass ejection. The release of this energy is a very impulsive and strong process compared with the accumulation of magnetic energy. And this is well shown by the fact that typically 10% of the energy of an active region that is, which is accumulated over a few days can be released in only a few tenths of minutes. And so the aim of my PhD was to study the conditions which are required for generating these flaring events, such as solar flares and coronal mass ejections. When you look at active regions, there is a very interesting feature. When you look at active regions during flares, there is an interesting feature that you can see when you look at the evolution of magnetograms. And namely, it's that the distribution of the magnetic flux during a flare remains quasi-constant. So this is shown here, where you can see the flux distribution in an active region, here 1 hour before a flare, and here 1 hour after a flare. And as you can see, there are not much differences between these two magnetograms. So this means that we can define a reference magnetic field that is invariant during the flare. And this invariant magnetic field is common to both magnetograms. And this magnetic field is the so-called potential magnetic field. It's a current-free magnetic field, and its 3D distribution is uniquely defined by the photospheric magnetic flux. So we have a reference field invariant during a flare, but on the other hand, we've just seen that solar flares and CMEs are associated with a strong and impulsive release of magnetic energy. So this means that they are associated with a strong 3D evolution of the magnetic field, and because the reference field is invariant, this means that the source of magnetic energy for flares cannot come from the potential magnetic field. So it has to come from another source of magnetic energy. And the question is, what is the origin of this released energy? Well, we can answer this question using Kelvin's decomposition of a magnetic field. So you can show that in this decomposition, the magnetic field is expressed as the sum of two components: the potential field on one hand, associated with the V, and which is given by the flux distribution of the photosphere, and a second component called the current carrying component of the magnetic field, and that's the component that contains all the electric currents of the magnetic field B. And then Kelvin's theorem tells us that the total energy of the magnetic field B is simply equal to the energy of the potential magnetic field plus the energy of the current carrying magnetic field. And the energy of the second component is the so-called free magnetic energy. And so as I said, the potential field is invariant during a flare, and so it is magnetic energy. So this equation is telling us two things. First, the potential field defines a minimum of magnetic energy, because energy is by definition a positive quantity. And two, free energy is the only component that can be released during a flare. So free energy is the energy, the source of magnetic energy that powers solar flares and coronal mass ejection. This free energy comes from the presence of electric currents. And as we have seen earlier, the electric currents are the signature of magnetic shear in the magnetic fields. So this means that magnetic energy is naturally provided in active regions from the transfer of magnetic shear. And the consequence is that magnetic shear plays a fundamental role for storing the energy that powers solar flares and coronal mass ejection. So one possible mechanism for releasing impulsively the free energy is magnetic reconnection. Magnetic reconnection is a non-ideal process that induces the change, a change in the connectivity of the magnetic field lines. So if, for instance, we take this MHD flare model that I will develop, that I will discuss in the last part of this talk. So we initially have close twisted magnetic field lines here, surrounded by potential magnetic field lines here in blue. And then by changing the connectivity of the magnetic field, the reconnection between these two field lines leads to the reconfiguration of the magnetic field, as can be seen here, with red field lines which are now open and blue field lines which are now closing the photosphere. This modification of the magnetic field, leads to the redistribution and the ejection of magnetic shear and electric current, and hence of free magnetic energy. And here you can see the evolution of magnetic energy in this MHD model. And as you can see, during the reconnection phase, 90% of the free energy is released. So this shows that magnetic reconnection is very efficient for releasing and dissipating energy in active regions. And so magnetic reconnection plays a fundamental role for the energy release during solar flares and coronal mass ejection. One other thing that I want to mention is that magnetic reconnection is a very localized process that occurs at thin current sheets. Thin current sheets are regions where the electric current density has very strong gradients, and these current sheets can form at different regions, such as null point, so as was the case here. So null point, which are regions where the magnetic field vanishes, and more generally, thin current sheets can form at quasi-separatrix layers, which are regions where, which are volume of strong distortion, of the magnetic field. So in the previous slides, we have seen that for solar activity, we need two key features. The first one is we need magnetic shear, which is a key quantity for storing the magnetic energy that powers flaring activity. And we need magnetic reconnection to efficiently release this energy. So as I said, the objective, the aim of my thesis was to study the conditions for solar flares and coronal mass ejections. And to do that, I focused on studying the storage and release of magnetic shear in active regions in parallel with their flaring activity. And for that purpose, I used three quantities: magnetic helicity, which quantifies the global amount of magnetic shear in a volume; electric currents, which quantifies the amount of shear locally; and free energy, which gives an information of the magnetic shear in terms of magnetic energy. And so these three quantities are three coupled quantities that I used to address three specific questions that I will develop in the next section of this talk, and which were: how can we meaningfully map the flux of a global quantity such as magnetic helicity? What are the conditions for the neutralization of electric currents in active regions? And what are the relationships between the evolution of free energy and magnetic helicity during a flaring event caused by magnetic reconnection? So let's move to the first part of my thesis, which was about studying the distribution of magnetic helicity in active regions. So magnetic helicity is a global quantity that measures the braiding of magnetic field lines in a volume. It's a more general definition than magnetic twist and shear, and it can be positive or negative depending, for instance, on the direction of the twist. One important property of magnetic helicity is that it's a quasi-conserved quantity in the solar atmosphere. And because of this property, it has been conjectured that higher energy could be released during a flare if the flare is associated with helicity annihilation. That is to say, if the flare is associated with interactions between regions of opposite helicity. So observational studies have proposed to test this conjecture by mapping the photospheric flux of magnetic helicity in active regions. The idea is that to get helicity annihilation, you need to transport structures of opposite magnetic helicity into the solar atmosphere. And this should theoretically lead to opposite signals of helicity flux in the maps of helicity flux in active regions. The problem is that to do that, you need a surface density of helicity flux. So you need a local definition of magnetic helicity. But we have just seen that magnetic helicity is inherently not a local quantity. So how can we meaningfully map the flux of such a global quantity? Well, to answer this question, we can start by taking the mathematical expression of magnetic helicity. So this equation shows that helicity is a double integral over the magnetic flux of a quantity called LAC. LAC is the Gauss linking number, and in the context of magnetic flux, it gives you the number of times that a magnetic field line A or C is turning around another magnetic field line. So this equation is basically saying that helicity is the total linking number of all pairs of magnetic field lines in your configurations. So if you want to define a meaningful density of magnetic helicity, you need two things. First, it has to account for the notion of magnetic field lines, and two, it has to account for the notion of linking number of field lines. So if you do that, and you play with the equation here, then you can rewrite helicity as a single integral of a quantity h phi here, which corresponds to the helicity of a field line. And what this expression here is showing us is that the helicity of a field line corresponds to the total linking number of a magnetic field line A. So it describes the number of times that a field line A will turn around each one of the other magnetic field line C of your configuration. So h phi here defines a density of magnetic helicity, and its time derivative defines a helicity flux density. And this helicity flux density quantifies the variation of the total linking number of each magnetic field lines in your configuration. And these two quantities are the only ones that have a physical meaning. Okay. So we have defined a density of helicity flux, so a local definition of density, but we are not done yet because our goal is to map the helicity flux in active regions. And to do that, we need a surface density of helicity. Then Paria et al. In 2005 have shown that we can define a surface density helicity from the helicity flux density here by redistributing the helicity flux density at both foot points of a field line A and by weighting by the magnetic field at these points. So this defines the surface density of helicity G phi, which basically gives you an information on the relative rotation of field lines in a configuration. So the problem is that a surface density of helicity can only be a proxy of a true helicity density, which is defined per magnetic field lines. And because of that, there is no unique definition of a surface density of helicity. And so there is another definition, which is usually used in observation, G theta. And what this equation is showing is that G theta computes the helicity flux in terms of rotation of magnetic polarities. So in terms of rotation of C minus with regard to A minus, C plus, and A plus, for instance. And the reason why G theta is usually used in observation is because it is easier to implement than G phi. And this comes from the fact that you can compute the helicity flux density map here simply from photospheric data. So simply from a time series of magnetograms, you can synthesize such a map. On the other hand, to compute G phi, you need to compute G theta, but you also need to know the magnetic connectivity. This is because the helicity flux density, so the helicity flux for a field line, depends on G theta at both foot points of the magnetic field line. Okay. So the main difference here between the G theta and G phi is that G theta disregards the notion of magnetic field lines. And as I will show in the next slides, the result is that the helicity flux density map that you're computing with G theta can exhibit simultaneous, spurious opposite signals. And this is a problem when what you want to do is to look at active regions in which you have real opposite helicity fluxes. So I implemented a method to compute G phi in active regions, and I tested it on several analytical and MHD models to validate it. So here is an example that we consider. It's an MHD model of a quadrupolar magnetic field, and the magnetic field is initially potential, and we transfer magnetic helicity into this configuration by imposing photospheric translation of this magnetic polarity here. So here at the center, I'm plotting the helicity flux density maps with G theta. So when you don't take into account the notion of magnetic field lines. And what you can see is that there are strong positive and negative helicity fluxes in these maps. Now on the right, I'm plotting the helicity flux density map with my method. So when you take into account the proper definition of helicity flux density by taking into account the notion of field lines. And as you can see here, the motion are actually essentially transferring positive magnetic helicity into the magnetic fields. And this shows you basically that the strong negative fluxes that you are observing here in G theta are spurious signals. And they are spurious signals because G theta does not take into account the notion of field lines. One other important thing that I want to mention here is that even a simple local motion of a magnetic polarity can lead to a large scale and complex injection of magnetic helicity. Then, with a different test that I did, I showed that the connectivity-based method presents three advantages. First, it allows to remove the spurious opposite signals that you can see with G theta. It gives you a trustworthy intensity of the signal of helicity flux, and it allows you to study the helicity flux in active regions in 3D. And this is illustrated here, where I'm plotting the helicity flux density per field lines, and where you can see that the motion are inducing only red signals, which means positive helicity flux. And so to conclude, this method is best suited to test the relationships between high energy release during flares and helicity annihilation. So then I applied my method to highly eruptive active regions to test cosenoidal conjecture. The target we chose was this famous quadrupolar active region from February 2011. And previous studies of helicity flux for its active regions had found positive and negative helicity fluxes. The problem is that this method used the wrong surface density of helicity flux. So these negative helicity fluxes here could simply be spurious signals, as in the example I showed before. To apply my method, I need to know the magnetic field in 3D. And the problem is that, as you know, the magnetic field is mainly measured at the photosphere, so in 2D. So we used the photospheric data from HMI and the reconstruction extrapolation method from Valory et al. To reconstruct the magnetic field of the active region. And here you can see a sample of magnetic field lines from the extrapolation. Then I used the connectivity of the magnetic field lines of this extrapolation to compute the Helicity flux density map with the connectivity-based method. And so with my method, I was able to confirm the opposite signals of Helicity flux in this active region. And by studying and by plotting the Helicity flux density per magnetic field line, I was able to identify two magnetic structures of opposite helicity, one central structure with positive Helicity flux, below a structure with negative Helicity flux. Then, if we look at this subregion here I'm zooming in, and then I'm rotating the field of view, then you can see that we have a magnetic structure here with positive Helicity flux, fully surrounded by magnetic field lines with negative Helicity fluxes. And so this region is potentially favorable to flaring activity associated with annihilation of magnetic helicity. So I analyzed the AIA data at 171 angstrom, and 30 minutes after the time at which I computed the helicity density here, I was able to find a flare occurring in this very region, so a flare which is potentially associated with helicity annihilation. And so the next step will be to compute the total energy released during this flare to start testing Cusano et al.'s conjecture. So in conclusion, I developed a new method to study the helicity flux in active region. This method allows to reveal the artifact that comes from a previous method that does not consider the notion of magnetic field lines. It allows to study the helicity flux density in active region in 3D, and it's well suited to study the relationship between higher energy release and helicity annihilation. And by applying it to a highly flaring active region, I was able to identify a flare possibly associated with the annihilation of magnetic helicity.
Kevin, can I ask a question about that first part? So the connectivity seems to be an important part, but of course the connectivity depends on the extrapolation used, yes. And there are there have been studies that have shown sensitivities to boundary conditions, et cetera, and different results coming from different types.
Yes.
How much do you think that would affect the connectivity and hence the results?
So I did some checks with that. So what we did, so here I showed only the helicity flux density when you compute it from a nonlinear force-free field. But I also used potential magnetic field extrapolation so that you can compare them. And I also tested with another type of extrapolation model from Wigelmann et al. And what I found is that basically on the large scales structures, you can locate the helicity injection with a precision of 10 megameters, which is typically the precision that was estimated by Wigelmann and Tolman, I don't remember in which paper. But then if you look at the main differences that you will see will be in regions where you have strong electric currents, basically. So in regions where you have flux drop, for instance, or stuff like that. But overall you can get a good idea of the sign of helicity injection simply from at least the large scale. And with a 10 megameter precision, I think it's quite okay compared to the size of the active region. Okay, so let's move to the second part of my thesis, which was about the neutralization of electric currents in active region. So in the convection zone and in the solar atmosphere, magnetic flux tubes are believed to be well confined and isolated. This means that if you take a twisted flux tube, like this one, and then we draw a closed curve C around this flux tube, then the total electric current enclosed by this curve should be equal to 0. We can explain this as follows. Let's consider a potential vertical magnetic field between two parallel plates. So I drew a contour C again. The magnetic field being potential, the total electric current enclosed by C is vanishes. Now, let's apply photospheric motions to the field line foot points inside of C so as to create a twisted flux tube, a confined twisted flux tube, in this region. The velocity field is null along C and outside of C. So if you look at the configuration then at a later time, you now have a twisted flux tube, and the total electric current, which is enclosed by C, corresponds to the total electric current flowing inside of this flux tube. And because the velocity field is 0 along C, the magnetic field, which is along C, remains constant during the twisting. So this means that the circulation of the magnetic field, and so the electric currents, remain equal to its initial value. And so the electric currents, the total currents that is carried by this flux tube, has to be 0. So because the magnetic flux tube is twisted, the electric current density J is non-zero in the flux tube. So the condition of no net current flowing in this flux tube implies that there are two types of electric current in your flux tubes which are flowing in opposite directions. These are the so-called direct and return currents. The direct currents are the electric currents which are expected from the twist direction. So for this twisted flux tube, it's right-handed flux tube. So the right-hand rule is basically telling me that the direct currents are flowing upward, like this. Then the return currents are by definition shielding currents, which form an envelope around the direct current here, and which have an opposite direction than the direction of the direct currents. And so in this case, the return currents are flowing downwards. And so the condition of the net currents means that the return currents are neutralizing the direct currents. So because magnetic flux tubes are supposed to be well isolated in the convection zone and in the corona, it was expected that electric currents should be neutralized in active regions. That is to say that the total electric currents integrated over each single magnetic polarity of the active region should be 0. So observational studies have started to address the question of neutralization of electric currents in active regions. And while some of them show active regions with neutralized electric currents, others are showing, or seems to be showing, active regions with a net current. It's the example of this it's the case of these active regions analyzed by Gorgoulis et al., and in which they found a total current of about -10 tera-ampere in the positive polarity. -10 tera-ampere is about 100 times the noise level. So it seems that in these active regions, there is a net electric current. But on the other hand, return currents tend to be much weaker and much more spread than the direct currents. So it's possible that net currents in active region simply arise from the fact that you have a very bad precision on the return currents, and your measurements of return currents are very poor. Now, on the other hand, CME models require a net electric current. And active regions are definitely showing the generation of CMEs. So it has been argued that these net electric currents should be real. But then, if these net currents are real, then there seems to be an inconsistency with the condition of isolated magnetic flux tubes. So this brings two questions. First, can a net electric current exist within the solar atmosphere? And if yes, then how could the transport of current-neutralized twisted flux tubes from the convection zone into the solar corona lead to net coronal electric currents? So to answer these questions, we used numerical MHD simulations of the two main mechanisms that are responsible for electric currents in active regions, and namely magnetic flux emergence and photospheric flows. So let's start with magnetic flux emergence. This simulation this is a work to which I contributed, but which was essentially carried out by Tibor Torok from PSI. So we start with a current-neutralized twisted flux tube placed inside of the convection zone. Here you can see in red the direct currents and in blue the return currents. We impose a density depletion in this region to make the twisted flux tube buoyant and to make it rise into the convection zone and emerge into the solar atmosphere of our numerical domain. And then we follow the properties of the photospheric electric currents during the emergence. So here you can see the vertical electric current distribution at the photosphere in the late phase of emergence. And here you can see both positive and negative electric current density in both the positive and the negative magnetic polarities. So this means that the emergence of a current-neutralized flux tube leads to the emergence of both direct and return currents into the solar atmosphere. Then here, we are plotting the evolution of magnetic flux and electric current in the positive magnetic polarities. And as you can see, as soon as the flux tube emerges into the coronal part of our domain, strong net electric currents are injected into the corona. And we find that the origin of this net currents is related to the fact that most of the return currents remain below the photosphere, so in the convection zone. And so this simulation shows that magnetic flux emergence can transport net electric currents in the solar atmosphere. So as I said before, magnetic flux emergence is only one of the two mechanisms, of the main mechanism that brings electric currents in the corona. And the second is are photospheric flows. So I analyzed the neutralization of electric currents generated by simplified photospheric flows, and namely by photospheric twisting and shearing of two opposite magnetic polarities. To do that, I performed 3D zero-beta MHD simulations using the code developed by Olanier et al. In 2005. We start with a potential magnetic field, with this potential magnetic field, and we apply twisting and shearing motion to these two polarities here. And so this either results in the buildup of a twisted magnetic flux tubes or in the buildup of sheared magnetic arcades. In these simulations, there is a free parameter that controls the size of the regions over which electric currents are built up. And so I played with this parameter to study its effect on the neutralization of electric currents. And in the following, I will only present you the result from the twisted flux tubes because of time constraints. But the results and conclusions that I will present are valid for both cases, so sheared and twisting motions. So here at the bottom, you can see the photospheric electric current density for narrow twisting vortices. As you can see, this creates a strongly localized distribution of electric currents with negative direct currents surrounded by positive return currents. Here you can see the same results, but for broad twisting vortices. So we still have the negative direct currents surrounded by the positive return currents. But in this case, the distribution of electric currents is much more spread, and this distribution actually extends up to the polarity inversion line. Now, as I said, here we are interested in the neutralization of electric current. So to study that, we define neutralization ratio, which is equal to the absolute value of the total return current divided by the total direct current inside of the positive magnetic polarity, so in this region. If this ratio is equal to 1, then electric currents are neutralized, and if not, then there is a net electric current flowing inside of the magnetic configuration. Here I'm now plotting the neutralization ratio for each one of the twisting simulations, and what we found is that for narrow twisting vortices, the neutralization ratio remains equal to 1 during the whole simulation, which means that electric currents remain neutralized during the whole simulation. On the contrary, for broad twisting vortices, the system shows the development, the quick development of net electric current in the magnetic field. So as for magnetic flux emergence, localized photospheric motion can also generate a net electric current in the solar atmosphere. And what we found is that these net currents only happen in the presence of magnetic shear at the polarity inversion line. So that's illustrated here, where the green arrow shows the photospheric transverse magnetic field. And we find that the photospheric transverse field develops a component aligned with the polarity inversion line, which is the signature of magnetic shear at the pile, only for broad twisting vortices. Okay. So in summary, using MHD simulations of the two main mechanisms that brings electric currents in active regions, we showed that net coronal electric current can exist in the solar atmosphere. They are due to the partial emergence of current-neutralized magnetic flux tube, and they are associated with sheared polarity inversion lines. And our interpretation of the relationship between net currents and sheared pile is that both magnetic flux emergence and photospheric motion can bring magnetic shear at the pile. And when you look at the Ampere's law, it tells you that magnetic shear at the pile necessarily induces force-free net current in the configuration. And by showing that net electric currents can be dynamically generated in MHD, our two studies show a strong support for CME models based on a magnetic configuration containing a net electric current. Okay, so let's move to the third and final part of my PhD work, and which was about the relationship between energy release and helicity release during reconnection. So, as we've seen in the introduction, magnetic reconnection is very efficient for releasing and dissipating magnetic energy, and for redistributing and reducing the helicity content of a magnetic field. So the question is there a simple direct relationship between the amount, between the free energy and the magnetic helicity that are released by magnetic reconnection? And we address this question in the context of solar coronal jets. Here is an example of solar jets. Solar coronal jets are well-collimated eruptive events during which you can often see torsional plasma motions, and these torsional plasma motions are the signature of the ejection of magnetic helicity. So to model solar jets, we used the model developed by Paria et al. 2005, which is based on magnetic reconnection occurring at a 3D null point. So the initial magnetic field is potential, and the null point is at the interface between a closed magnetic field, here in cyan, and an open magnetic field, here in white. This is a typical configuration which is observed for solar coronal jets. And then we build up, we store magnetic free energy inside of a closed magnetic field by imposing twisting motion to the central positive polarity. And the MHD equations are advanced in time using the ideal MHD code from Devor 91. So the twisting motions applied at the positive polarity here leads to the accumulation of magnetic energy and free helicity in the domain, in the closed magnetic field. Eventually, the system becomes unstable, which leads to the impulsive release of free energy via magnetic reconnection occurring between the blue magnetic field, the closed magnetic field, and the open magnetic field. And this impulsive energy release results in an helical jet, and the helical jet is caused by the collimated ejection of magnetic helicity along the open magnetic field lines. And then the system undergoes a relaxation phase, during which it reaches a state close to its initial potential state. So in this case, the open field here is vertical, and this results in the generation of a jet in the vertical direction. So I did a parametric analysis to study the effect of the inclination of the open field here on the properties of the jets. Here is an example for an inclination of the open field of 10 degrees. And you can see the jets through the increase in plasma density. One more time. Okay. So I did simulations with different inclinations between 1 and 20 degrees. And here you can see the evolution of free energy for each of these simulations. The first thing to notice is that each case presents a sudden and impulsive release of magnetic energy, which means that there is a solar helical jet generated in each of these simulations. And the other interesting thing is that each curve is different, which means that the evolution of free energy in the simulations depends on the inclination of the open magnetic field. So to write down, yeah. Okay, and now here I'm plotting the free energy stored at the time of the jet as a function of the inclination. And you can see that the larger the inclination of the open field, the lower is the amount of free energy stored inside of the closed magnetic field, which means that less free energy is stored at the time of the jet and less free energy is released during the jet. And as you can see, dependence on the inclination is strong, since for a 20-degree inclined magnetic field, the free energy release is only half the value for a vertical magnetic field. So to identify the origin of this strong dependence, I looked at the kinetic energy curves. To be able to meaningfully compare these curves, I normalize them and I align them with regard to their maximum. So this gives me this normalized kinetic energy curves in which I was able to identify two phases. The helical, the jet phase, which is associated with the impulsive release of free energy, and a pre-jet phase here, which is associated with a slow and quasi-steady dissipation of magnetic energy. And these two phases are actually the signatures of two reconnection regimes identified by Paria et al. 2010, one quasi-steady reconnection mode and one impulsive reconnection mode. Yeah? Yeah. You're asking about the resistivity, right? No, it's a kind of numerical resistivity. And yeah, it's a kind of numerical resistivity. That's it. Okay. So during the pre-jet phase, we have a competition between free energy buildup by the photospheric motion and free energy dissipation by the reconnection at the null point. During this phase, free energy is released, but not magnetic helicity. This phase, during this phase, we can observe the generation of a jet said standard, and this standard jet strongly depends on the inclination of the open field. On the other hand, during the helical jet phase, we have an impulsive release of both free energy and magnetic helicity. During this phase, we observe the generation of the helical jet, which is also called the blowout jet. This jet is influenced by the standard jet, but not by the inclination of the open field. In particular, we observe a stronger standard, when we have a stronger standard jet, we have a lower release of energy during the blowout jet. So to conclude with this section, using MHD modeling of solar coronal jets, I studied the relationship between energy and helicity released during magnetic reconnection. We were able to identify, and what I found, is that the relationship between energy and helicity release strongly depends on the properties of magnetic reconnection and on the geometry of the magnetic field. And in particular, we observed two different phases. One phase during which you have a free energy release and no helicity ejection, and a phase during which you have a strong release of both quantities. And with the fact that the properties of a jet strongly depends on the magnetic field geometry, we predict that if your configuration is close to axisymmetry, then you should observe more energetic and more twisting jet. Okay, so if you are expecting a conventional conclusion, then you will be disappointed because I chose not to make one. And so, well, the thing is that it's only two informal slides of conclusion. So the first one was just to say that if you are interested by by these topics on which I worked during my thesis, and if you want to discuss them with me, then my office is 3626, and you're welcome to come anytime you want, usually during the second part of the week, because the first part of the week I'm at CISL. So anyway. And the second slide is for advertising. So it's just to say that I will be here for 2 years, working on data constraint reconstruction of the coronal magnetic field with Sarah Gibson, mainly with Sarah Gibson and Doug Nishka, who are my two supervisors. But this project also involves many more people from HAO, people from the CFA, the Predictive Science Institute, Inc., and Durham University. So thank you for your attention and Happy New Year.
Questions for Kevin?
You were talking about net current in the atmosphere. You had a slide that showed the ratio between the direct current and then the surrounding currents.
Yes.
And that goes to about, it comes up when you have the flux injected, and it stayed, it sort of asymptotically approached some value like a half. Yeah,
This one.
it stays there. It doesn't go to zero. Are you continuing to inject flux into the atmosphere, or is it strictly the photospheric motions that are allowing that net current?
No, that's strictly the photospheric motion that which are inducing the net current.
And was that a reasonable number you used in your model for the motion speeds?
Yeah, if you go to It's MHD, so it's scaleless here. But if you try to scale with active regions typical numbers, then you find a net current that can reach 10 teraamp, a few tenths of a few teraamperes, sorry. So which is found in observations, in some observations.
Questions?
So also about this part here, I think you were saying that the cases where you do have like the blue line, there's a sheared polarity inversion line.
Yeah.
And I think in the earlier observational work of Georgalis, or you were saying there were some cases where there was net current and some cases were not. Does the observation correlate with net current with the sheared neutral line?
Yes, if you look at the observations in active regions, then most of the, well, from what I'm aware of, all active regions in which you have a sheared polarity inversion line are associated with a net current. But I would say that the thing is, you could have sheared polarity inversion line with a neutralized electric current if, for instance, you have a magnetic field with opposite helicities. So imagine that you have two structures of opposite helicities, each with a net electric current, but with the same opposite electric current. Then your total magnetic configuration will have zero net current in each polarity. But for simple active regions in which you only have a single sign of magnetic helicity, net currents are due to shear at the polarity inversion line. Yeah.
Other questions? You have a very naive question. So you said the magnetic shear is very fundamental in this process. So when you when you inject or impose the shear, is that through a boundary specification or?
At the photospheric boundary, we impose the velocity field of magnetic field lines through point. That's what we are doing here.
No more questions? Thank you again.